Well, welcome to our program today on the lost bridges of Montgomery County. I want to thank Scott Bombay for speaking to us. He is the author of a book on that topic. He is also president of the Bucks County Covered Bridge Society and works for the Constitution Center. So I think we're very fortunate to have him come here on this beautiful autumn day and present a program. Mr. Bombay?
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Hi, my name is Scott Bomboy. I am a local historian, journalist, covered bridge aficionado, and I'm going to get into some history about Montgomery County's covered bridges. And I'll get into how I got into covered bridges. I'll do a little overview of why they were important. There'll be a little quiz for the audience, not a difficult quiz. There's no wrong answer, basically, but we'll get into the topic of covered bridges. And to me, it's been an eye-opener because I am an historian. I really didn't get involved with this until, okay, let me see if this works here. These are my two books, by the way. They are on Amazon.com. I do have the last 5 copies I have in my bag, if you're interested. The left is called Wooden Treasures, The History of Bucks County's Covered Bridges. I went back to grad school 8 years ago and got my master's in history from Arizona State Online. And one of my 2 grad school projects was the Bucks County Covered Bridges. And after that, I did a series of talks about bridges. I became interested in why Montgomery County doesn't have a covered bridge. And I did the second book. I finished that this spring. And I got married at the covered bridge in Perkiomen in 2006. I had no interest in covered bridges before that. If you notice, the bridge there from 2006, July, is perfectly straight up and down. And about 10 years after that, my wife and I were driving down Walnut Street in Perkiomen, and I did the one mistake you never make in a marriage. She said the bridge was leaning to the left-hand side. I said, no, that's not right. So obviously she was correct. It was leaning to the one side. I've been involved in that preservation project pretty much for the past 8 years. If you're familiar with the South Perkiomen Covered Bridge, it's in Lenape Park. We had raised $220,000 to repair it, and then it was hit by Hurricane Ida, moved 15 feet off to the right. I'm also an elected official in Perkiomen, and I was in contact with FEMA through 2.5 years of insurance claims with FEMA. We got full coverage. The project's actually going to start in 2 weeks. We hired an expert from Oregon and Canada to come down to do the plan, and we were able to get our claim of $500,000 from FEMA. So as part of doing that, if you've ever been involved in an insurance claim, sometimes they're reluctant to pay out, and because they want to make sure all the I's are, dotted, T's are crossed, there's no fraud or anything. So over the course of that, I really have become a subject matter expert in covered bridges. Next weekend, I'm the featured speaker at the National Covered Bridge meeting in Worcester, Massachusetts. I will be talking about the Green Lane Bridge during that presentation. And to me, it's an interesting topic. There's always a story with a covered bridge. I'm trying to get, and what I usually do is do a couple warm-up questions. And the question I'm always asked are, why are covered bridges covered? So you have 4 options up here. One option is to keep the animals calm when crossing the bridge. The other option here is to keep the bridge's deck dry. C is to create a shelter from bad weather, and D, all of the above. So does anybody want to venture a guess? D is possibly accurate, but not the original reason why they did that. There's basically in the year 1820, there was a guy named Ithiel Town. He was the first real bridge architect who was a trained architect. And he did a patent for his bridge. He said if you covered the deck, it would last 7 times longer because wood under stress, it does dry out. That was the original reason. A lot of people used it for shelter from bad weather. There are rumors, especially in Bucks County, that kids played hooky on it. There may have been some kissing in the bridges, basically. The record of animals crossing the bridge to calm down, probably not. There are instances of animals who actually got excited in the covered bridges. I know out in Western Pennsylvania, they lost a covered bridge over a river due to a cattle stampede. Because is with a wooden structure, you don't want a lot of shear weight. And if you have a lot of cattle who are not happy, it was a long bridge. I think they got 30 feet into the creek and the bridge went in the water and the cattle. So may not be the best explanation. That's the answer. Okay. And where was America's first covered bridge? We have 4 possible answers here: Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and Harrisburg. The answer is C. The current location is 30th and Market Street. And this is 30th and Market Street back in probably 1814 in the picture here. And the forefront is Timothy Palmer's permanent covered bridge, the first covered bridge in America. Behind that, there's another bridge called the Colossus Bridge, built by Louis Vernvog. Pennsylvania is the home of covered bridge building, despite what New England may say. We had the first bridge. Bucks County had the second bridge. Northampton County had the third bridge. Another question: how many covered bridges once existed in Pennsylvania? The correct answer is C. And the group I'm speaking with next week, the National Covered Bridge Society, they've tracked since the late 50s a history of all the bridges they can locate that were in the United States. And at one point, I think there were more than 10,000 in the US. Today, there's under 800 left. But Pennsylvania basically has 207, which is the most of any state. And if you look at this chart here, we have more covered bridges than all of New England, which probably irritates them to a certain extent because they do like their covered bridges. Ohio has a lot. Ohio had more at one point. Indiana, which is famous for its covered bridges, they have 88. New Hampshire has 55. And Oregon actually built bridges in the 1940s because they were practical. So they have a collection of newer bridges. Now in Pennsylvania, Lancaster County has the most covered bridges with 29. Washington County has 23, which is interesting because they're all exactly identical. And that's below Pittsburgh. I've been to Columbia. I've seen their bridges. Chester County has a great collection of bridges they share with Lancaster. What you won't see on this list is Montgomery County, because Montgomery County does not have a covered bridge. And if you were to try to drive around and see all these bridges, they're in 6 groups of locations for the most part. And we have the group in our area, the Lehigh Valley group, Chester, Lancaster County. There's a group in South Central Pennsylvania, Columbia, Northumberland, where they have the Covered Bridge Festival every year. And there's the group around Pittsburgh. Now, before covered bridges, especially across rivers, you had very few options to get across a river. You could take a ferry, pay the toll, either you or your livestock or whatever, or you could find a way. You're not going to, you'd have to find a canoe or something to get across the rivers. And the first covered bridges were actually on rivers. They weren't on the creeks in the back country. And the thing about ferries is usually the most prominent person in a river town owned the ferry. And they figured out pretty quickly they could charge more on tolls if they had a bridge and a ferry, because ferries are really dependent on weather. Now, Montgomery County, through my research, I've confirmed 36 covered bridges that existed in the county. And we're talking about the county, we're talking from Lower Merion to Upper Monco, which is a big area. The smaller original bridges were more in the south part of the county. Now, if you go to Bucks County, we had 51 bridges. And we have 12 still. The 12, and if you look at the red dots there, they're the 12 that currently exist. 10 are original, 2 are replicas, 2 were arsoned and rebuilt. And this question kept coming up in talks I would do. I did talks in Bucks County. I've probably done 30 talks on covered bridges. I crossed over into the Monco area. I talked to Peter Becker, Saturday Mennonite, did the tour there, Indian Valley Public Library. And I would bring up the question, or the topic is, Montgomery, look at New Jersey, they only have one bridge. Montgomery County has none. And I would look out in the audience and usually be somebody who would be agitated when I brought that up from Monco, because they remembered the bridge that is currently would be under Green Lane Reservoir. Now, does anybody here remember that bridge? Okay, so we have at least three witnesses, basically. And it was, we'll get into that in a bit. It was definitely the most photographed bridge in Montgomery County. It was very well known. The bridge here I'm showing is the bridge in Norristown. So if you're familiar with Norristown, you cross over 202 in the Schuylkill. That was a covered bridge at one point. Now, and this map here shows the 13 bridges that existed on the Schuylkill. And in my research in Bucks County, we only had 11 bridges on the Delaware. So this was actually fairly well built out with bridges. And one of the reasons why, they were hooked into the Schuylkill Canal. And if you know anything about the Schuylkill Canal, that was built as a project in the 1810s, 1820s to bring coal down from the coal region to Philadelphia. The first bridge on the Schuylkill is little known. I had to do a lot of research and work with another historian on this. There was a bridge called the Flat Rock Covered Bridge built in 1810. Does anybody know what the current name of Flat Rock is? The current name is Manayunk. They changed the name because once they had more money down there where the canal, Flat Rock was actually, there was a flat rock in the river, right? So they called it Flat Rock. And the Flat Rock Company worked with Schuylkill Navigation to basically bring the canal down to Philadelphia through this way. This bridge is a bit of a mystery. I've worked with a guy named Ron Knapp, who's a bridge historian, and we've tried to figure out, we don't know who built it. We know it's an artwork. It's got a single arch, but we don't know who built it, but it was definitely there until, I believe, the 1840s. The other big bridge in Manayunk was called the Manayunk Covered Bridge, and that was connected by the canal. And if you know Manayunk at all, at one point when I moved back here in 2002, I worked for NBC 10, and I would drive down from that point in Upper Dublin, the back way through Manayunk, and go over the Green Lane Bridge to work. So the current Green Lane Bridge, that's the bridge that used to be there. It was a very long, 600-foot long town lattice covered bridge. Manayunk was a mill town, and this was a critical structure for them. This is another view of a lithograph in the 1930s of the Manayunk Bridge in service. You'll see this is looking from the south north in Philadelphia up to Schuylkill, and you'll see that bridge in the etching, how long it was. And it's actually built into the mill system. And the canal would also be tied into this. Another significant bridge was Matson Ford. And one of my earlier employers was TV Guide. When I got out of college, I would go in the Matson Ford Bridge to go down to Matson Ford Road. I had to work with the historian for Conshohocken to get these two pictures because picture research was difficult in the project. And what you'll see on the one on the right-hand side, there's a little covered bridge before the big bridge. And this was built in 1838. I think it went out of service in the 1860s. It was a critical link on the Schuylkill, but they had to put a more modern structure in there because of the traffic. The other most photographed bridge in Montgomery County was the Cobb Street Bridge, which I know well from having to commute down there. That was built in 1829. It lasted almost 100 years. And if you can imagine going into Norristown, going over to Bridgeport, having to go over an 800-foot long covered bridge, that is what they had there. And that bridge was always kind of like the bad boy of bridges. There was trouble with it and had issues. It was built by the Corson family. There was the Corson father, the Corson son. They were famous bridge builders. And they were the county engineers. They also were the main operators of the Underground Railroad. And there are stories about either that bridge or there's a bridge called Pauline's that was used as part of the Underground Railroad to bring people up from Maryland. It's a really kind of a storied historical bridge, very well photographed. This is also from the 1880s. You'll notice on the left-hand side, if you can see it, it's got 3 lanes in the covered bridge. And the passenger lane is the middle lane. And what they would do is sometimes they would use it for carts. It was later used for a trolley to go through there. This is a drawing. There's a guy named Thaddeus Fowler who did these perspective maps. I think you may have seen them before. And he would come into town. He would go around town. He would draw things, ask people about things, and then take subscriptions for his paid map. So this is an isolated view of the late 1880s of the Cobb Street Bridge. And you can see it's got the 3 lanes. it's got curvature on the roof. It's not really a flat roof. That's because the piers are a little off in the river. The piers are not perfectly aligned with each other. It's called a humpback bridge. So it's got this design issue with it. And the bridge was always kind of under repair. And by 1920, the locals were not happy with the bridge. They wanted a modern bridge, even though it had the 3 lanes and everything. And a little politics in Montgomery County. Norristown and Bridgeport, they wanted $1 million bridge. They wanted the county to pay for it. And the county was not into it. There's a guy named Walter Sanborn, who was the editor of the Lansdale North Penn Reporter. And he was a real power player in Norristown. And Sanborn wrote all these editorials that were shared around about how evil this was. They're going to tax everybody. Norristown should pay for their own bridge. Bridgeport should pay for their own bridge. And they had the county commissioner's race. So Sanborn backed an anti-New Bridge candidate who was actually in Harleysville. He won the election. And 3 months later, the bridge burned down. And what happened was, it was early in the evening, not a lot of people on the bridge. The bridge is 800 feet long. The fire started in the middle, reached both ends within 60 seconds of the bridge. And they found an extraordinary amount of gasoline in the bridge. And the irony is the locals didn't want the bridge. So they came out, when anything was on fire back then, everybody from miles came around to watch it, because that's what they did. And they were actually chanting like burn, 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 because they hated the bridge. They were happy the bridge was burning down, which kind of came back to haunt them. And this is an actual picture of, there's many pictures of the fire. If you look on the picture, these are temporary supports that were in there to support it for truck traffic and car traffic. So the only problem in Norristown had is they only had another bridge for cars. It was called the Swedesford Bridge on Swedesford Road. And this was a bridge that was really converted for train use. It was called a Foreman Truss Bridge. So it's got this weird shape to it. It's hybrid metal wood. So the sides are wood. There's like basically tin paneling on the sides, a tin roof, a wooden deck. And this had 2 lanes. And on the side, they actually put an additional lane for a train. So this is the only way over Norristown and the Schuylkill River after the fire. So 3 months later, someone burns down this bridge. So they actually burned down they burnt their bridges in Norristown. So they had no way for a year to get across the river unless they went up to currently where Valley Forge is or down to Conshohocken. But it's all part of the politics, because they really wanted the county to pay for the bridge one way or another. And of course, it had the unfortunate accident where it burned down, and the county did pay $1 million for the bridge. This overhead view I got from a museum in Delaware, and this is right before the fire, probably in 1923. If you look in the middle, that's your Norristown Bridge there. And then you have the Swedesford Bridge above that, and then you have a train bridge and a passenger bridge. Another bridge that, I thought was interesting is Parker's Ford, if anybody knows where that is. So Parker's Ford, I cut through there when I go to Lancaster County in the back way. I'm kind of familiar with the area. If you were to go to that location today, that's your view going up the creek. So it's really close to the nuclear plant. Another interesting bridge was the Black Rock Bridge. If you know where Black Rock is, there's kind of like an elbow in the river, and there's a sanctuary there. They were very tightly connected to the Schuylkill Navigation Company. And if you look at that overhang lane on their bridge, usually it's for passengers, but it wasn't built for passengers. You know, there's a canal. What's an essential part of a canal? It was for the mule traffic. And they had to pay a fee per mule to get across the bridge, which is why that company was profitable, because back then, until the 1880s, all these big bridges on the Schuylkill were not owned by the government. They were owned by shareholder corporations. So you had shares in the Black Rock Bridge, you know, everything's good. There's tolls, you get dividends, unless there's like a flood or somebody burns down your bridge and you got a problem. And what happened at that time period in the 1880s, again, of course, the politics in Montgomery County, there was a commissioner's race. And the candidates said, we don't like these toll bridges. We're going to get rid of all the tolls. And they won the election. They had one estimate. It may have been $500,000 for freeing the bridges. I think it was 3 times as much they paid for it. So there was a big stink about that. Another photographed bridge is Montclair, which is up the river. Basically, that's a passenger thing on the side. That's not a mule lane, or basically. And if you look at the top of that, you can see that there's a gap in the bridge. There's little X's. That's a town lattice bridge. That's the lattice structure, or the truss structure. This is also very close to being flooded out if you look at the picture, because the piers are usually 6 to 8 feet clearance between the river. And this was not flooded out. I think this was taken out. I'll have to look at my book, possibly by the county, or it could have been arsoned. This is the Madison Bridge, which is up by Pottstown. And what's interesting about this bridge is the only known picture of the bridge being intact. This was hit by a tornado in 1879. And it took out a couple of spans, and they put a more modern, like cast iron or wrought iron section into it. And that was the farthest north bridge. There was a bridge in Pottstown. Now around here, the Perkiomen Valley had numerous covered bridges. And if you look on the map here in the circle, those are the bridges going up the Perkiomen. And you have these, the blue dots are railroad covered bridges. There were a couple that were currently, and if you look at the front of Green Lane, like behind where the pizza place is, and the bottom part of the reservoir, they had 2 Foreman Truss bridges there. Schwenksville had a very well photographed bridge. This is actually a glass plate negative picture. You have the train going by there, which is probably one of the branches of the Pennsylvania Railroad, I think the Perkiomen branch. And it's got 2 spans. This is also a town lattice bridge. This is one of the, I think there were 5 bridges that were deliberately arsoned in Montgomery County. This is one of the ones that was arsoned. Oaks had a covered bridge. I've been at Oaks is by 422, correct? In the back way to 422. And I think I've driven over the modern bridge several times. This is also a town lattice bridge. This was taken out in the 1930s by the county deliberately because they wanted to modernize the bridges over the river, the creek, actually. A great picture of a Foreman Truss railroad bridge in Zieglersville. You'll notice there's the booth there. You have the tracks going through. In the back is a small train about to come through the Perkiomen Junction Bridge. And again, these Foreman Truss bridges were actually developed by the railroad for a specific purpose. I'll show you a couple other ones in the county in a second, but they were hybrid bridges. They used tin and wood. They count as covered bridges because there's a roof that's covering the wooden deck. It's got a lot of metal work in. A lot of times they would take the roofs off because they were coal burning trains. This bridge, there's a local historian, John Ruth, you probably know about. I was having lunch with our mayor, Jeff Hollenbach, and John Ruth at Family Heritage. And I was bringing up the topic of this project I'm working on. I said, John, we have a section in my book about this bridge in Letter Rock. I've never seen a picture of the covered bridge. No one has. It's like, well, I have pictures because John grew up in the mill next to the bridge. And this is one of the, I think there's 3 known pictures he has of this bridge. I've never seen another picture of it. What's interesting is if you look at the rampway, it's like perpendicular to the bridge. So it isn't like usually it's a straight on, you go through the bridge. Because of the way the creek is in that section, it was built that way. Another bridge I found in my research, this is at Mercer Museum, was in Unionville. And if you know Route 309, it used to be the Pub 2 and the Rockin' Rebel, and you come up from Walmart. That's where that bridge is. And there was a person in the 1960s who wrote Mercer Museum saying, hey, we want some information about this bridge that was on our Rosenberger farm, and they put in 2 pictures. So we have a confirmed picture of the bridge, 2 pictures actually. And this was jointly owned by Montgomery County and Bucks County, but Montgomery County paid for the upkeep. And this was taken out by Montgomery County in 1913. Another bridge owned by the two counties was in Line Lexington. And if you're familiar with County Line Road, you're heading south from 309. It used to be a FMC, now it's Dorman, that big factory there. And there's a railroad crossing. That's where that bridge was. This was in road service to the 1930s, was mostly maintained by Bucks County, not Montgomery County, but it was on County Line Road. It still handled traffic well, but by 1936, both counties were pretty much in the process of taking their covered bridges out of road service. This is a picture from John Root's collection of the Telford covered bridge. If you're in Telford and you head out north from town on County Line Road, there's two dips in the road. The second dip is where this bridge would be today. And it's got a very long abutment system. And I've seen two other pictures. John had this really good picture with his family members in there. And it also has something called a stepped portal. If you look at the top of the bridge, it's decorative from that time period. This was taken out in 1932. An example of another Foreman Truss bridge. This is down by Abington and the Huntington Valley area. Was for a short run railroad down there, and they had basically a section on the creek where it was a horseshoe and they needed a bridge across the horseshoe. And they had several of these down there. This is the last one that was in service in Montgomery County for the Foreman Truss or the railroad. This would have been in the late 1920s when this picture was taken. So the last covered bridge in Montgomery County is the bridge that at least 3 people in this room know about. And that's the bridge, Markley's Mill, the most photographed bridge in Montgomery County. The left-hand picture is a colorized postcard from the time period, I think when it was Camp Minnehaha. There's a locator map that shows where part of the pier work is technically there encased in concrete on Knight Road, and that's the locator map. This is a classic picture of the bridge, a little around 300 feet long, which is a long town lattice covered bridge. It's photographed a lot. Was actually in pretty good shape when it was not when it was taken out. And the person who wound up living next to the bridge is Judge Harold Grove Knight. And Judge Knight, arguably the most influential person in Montgomery County toward the end of his life. He was the president judge of the county court. He had his regular home in his mansion in Ambler. And he bought the property up here in the late 1920s as a summer home, also to continue as a camp for kids. It had been used as a camp for kids before that. He helped organize the effort in the early 1940s to stop the county from demolishing the bridge. And the county reacquired the bridge from the state for the express purpose of preservation. And he owned the Markley Mills property until through the 1950s when it was taken by public domain by Philadelphia Suburban Water for the reservoir. I think this is from Tom's collection here. This is a picture of Camp Minnehaha, the Minnehaha chopping mill. And you can see the bridge in the background behind the big mill building. And this is probably from the early 1950s when it was in the process of being close to being demolished. The short story is, again, politics came into play. The water company bought a small piece of land up here at the foot of the mouth of the Perkiomen that fed what would be the reservoir, probably in the late 1920s. And after World War II, they decided they were going to build this reservoir project. And if you're familiar with the story, there was a group called the Friends of the Perkiomen that organized relatively quickly. They had dozens of government officials supporting them, residents, all kinds of groups. And they were in court for at least 3.5 years with the water company over the fate of the area that became the reservoir. What I did here in the library is went through the old printed copies of the Town and Country newspaper. And they have everything here. The library was great down there. And I traced the history of the dispute as seen by the locals. And the locals are extremely organized. They were well financed. They hired a former Pennsylvania Supreme Court justice to represent them in court. But they were up against basically the Philadelphia water people who had been granted the power of eminent domain by the state lawmakers. So they were in court a lot. They probably didn't win a lot of court cases. And you can see on these three clips here, at one point, to kind of calm down the Friends, the water company said, okay, we're going to preserve the covered bridge. Maybe half of it, we're going to move it into Green Lane Park and we'll fund the move. And what happened was the water company won all these legal battles, and it was pretty much a done deal. The reservoir was going to happen. But the problem was when the water company put out its plans for the reservoir, they were going to dead end Knight Road. And if you look at our equivalent, Lake Nakamixon in Bucks County, they did that at Lake Nakamixon. So if you go up the old Bethlehem Pike, it runs right by the lake house and under the lake. So you can't go across the lake that way. The Knights Road residents were organized and they went to court, and the court was usually Judge Knight's court, but Judge Knight could not be involved in that. And the court said, no, you can't dead end the road. You have to run it through the reservoir. And this greatly angered the water company because they had never lost a battle in court against the Friends or Rivers, who were the organizers. And they decided that, well, we can't afford to save your covered bridge because of this lawsuit. So they went out basically with the blessing of the county commissioners, because they had new commissioners who were elected. They went out in a matter of weeks and dismantled the bridge. And these are pictures right before the dismantling, where you can see they're doing work on the site where the bridge was. The bridge was in good shape. And one of the reasons it was is they had to repair it 2 or 3 years before this happened as part of the dispute. So it was a perfectly functioning bridge, but it happened to be in the wrong location. And this happened relatively quickly. And you can see where they basically took all the siding off, and they're in the process of dismantling the bridge. They did not move it. They just basically either sold the wood or got rid of it. And that was the end of that story. And that's why people, I believe, who remember that are so upset, because they were promised by the water company as part of the deal is they would take at least half of the bridge and put it back in the Green Lane Park, which they never did. And it's a shame because in the 1950s, there was a lot of preservation going on in covered bridges, and there probably would have been a solution. But the water company is the water company. They basically have all the cards in a situation like that. So the legacy of Montgomery County bridges is basically complicated because there are success stories like we have in Perkiomen. We saved our bridge. Not every town was successful or region was successful. They were very important in the early 1820s and 30s, the Lower Merion bridges, because they were key parts of the Schuylkill Navigation Company. And the Schuylkill Navigation Company brought the coal down to Manayunk and other parts. And they did really well until railroads came around. And once the railroads came in, there was not a use for the canals. They bought out the Philadelphia, I forget what, Philadelphia Reading. They bought out the canals at one point. And after that, it was just a matter of time for the covered bridges of Montgomery County, at least on the river, to be taken out. And it was just, for me, it was a great project because it's totally different in Bucks County, totally different political scene. And I always wanted to answer the question why Montgomery County doesn't have any covered bridges. And the reason was a lot of it was politics, to be honest with you. They were really into modernization of roadways, and they really had no idea or inkling to preserve anything that was historic when it came to the bridges. Judge Knight was probably, and his friends were the only people who acted in the 1940s when they tried to preserve their bridge in Green Lane. But even with all his power and influence, they were no match basically for the water company. And I want to close with a quick plug for my group, the Bucks County Covered Bridge Society. We were formed in 2008 as part of the effort to restore Moods Covered Bridge in Perkiomen. We do a lot of work notifying government officials when bridges are in bad shape. We advocate for certain issues. We got lights put in the bridge in New Britain, Pine Valley Bridge. And we do small projects like that to promote the bridges. And we do have a new product, if you're interested in this. If you have a cell phone and you use apps, we partnered with Bucks County Tourism Group to build an app. If you put the app on your phone, it'll take you automatically to any of the 12 bridges in Bucks County. So it's GPS based. If you're up in Sleeper Valley Road where there's no cell phone service, it'll still work. You won't get lost, because also, I would say 4 or 5 of those bridges in Tenneco, they don't have cell service. So it's better than having a printed map. if you have an app, a mobile device, and you do have apps, if you go into Google or Apple, just put in Bucks County Covered Bridges. It's a free app. Visit Bucks gave us $5,000 for that project. And it's really useful if you're interested in touring the existing covered bridges. So that's all I have for my presentation about Monco bridges. I'd be happy to take any questions about covered bridges in general, the Montgomery County covered bridges. I do know a little bit more about the back history I didn't get into, or the Bucks County covered bridges. So thank you. In the back.
Backing up to Norristown for just a minute. There's the R100 line that goes across the bridge that goes across the Schuylkill River. And I grew up in Norristown, and I used to take that, otherwise known as the PW,
Mhm.
Down to 69th Street on a regular basis. That's a building. Is there any particular history to that bridge? I never knew it to be covered, but do you know any history?
I do not. I know that the Cobb Bridge was obviously made into a modern bridge, and they didn't rebuild the Swedesford covered bridge. The railroad owned that bridge, and they just took it out. They said it's not worth us putting a new bridge in. So I'm not really that familiar with railroad bridge history.
Every time I've gone across it, it's like the trolley car rocks from side to side, and the bridge does not fall out stable. Keeps on going.
Yeah, well, hopefully it will. Yes. Yes. So the question is, are all covered bridges over water? Well, ours in Perkiomen, we had to move to preserve it, so it's actually over dry land. No. Yeah, that used to be the one that's currently in Lenape Park and Lenape Park in Perkiomen used to be by the mill up from the Perk. They did. It was if you're going down Walnut Street, the Perk is on your left hand side. You make a right. There's a mill there. That's was put there in 1832. There were 3 mills in Perkiomen at that point, 2 mills. So it was in road surface until August 1958. In that case, Bucks County condemned the bridge, and the Perkiomen residents raised the $3,000 to pick it up and move it. And they thought it would take a day and a half. It took 10 days. And it's just a whole other presentation, but no one was really, people were upset they moved that bridge and it became a media thing. So back when we only had 3 TV stations, they were there. The 4 newspapers were there. They never weighed or measured the bridge. So when they got out to the corner, it didn't move for 2 days. And there's film of that, there's video of that. And the picture was the AP wire photo of the day on a Saturday. So it was either an A1 or A2 of every newspaper in the country. And that shamed the county into, in the state also, into more preservation policy. Preservation first, not preservation last. But yes, it did go over the creek for 146 years. And it was in good shape when it was condemned. Yes, in the back. No, the question is, does PennDOT own most of the bridges in Bucks County? No, they don't. They only own 4. They own Sheard's Mill, Irwina, the one in Tyler State Park, and maybe Ullerstown. They own 4. The county owns 7, and Perkiomen owns 1. The Moods Bridge was owned by the state, but after it was arsoned and rebuilt, the state transferred it to the county. Yes. So the question is, were most of the covered bridges 1 lane? Yes, most of them were, but there's a bridge called a shotgun bridge, which is 2 lanes, and there's a wooden divider panel in the middle. They were used for river crossings because they were all toll bridges. And when you formed your, toll company, the shareholder company, the theory was you would make money off the dividends from the shares, and everybody invested in the stock. And there was one in Milford, Upper Black Eddy, that was a shotgun bridge. That one's unusual because it's 3, and there's reasons why they may have done that. There's still some shotgun bridges around. There's one out in Indiana that was actually moved into a park. They're kind of rare at this point, but it was not a common thing, but it was one thing that was used really to maximize the toll stuff. And you have to remember that the government was not really involved with covered bridges, the big bridges, until really in Montgomery County to 1886. It was all privately financed. Yes.
I've been to all the bridges in Madison County. And I highly recommend it as a vacation for any of you who want to travel to the middle of the country and see these bridges that are in the middle of kind of nowhere. They're absolutely beautiful. Some of them have romantic folklore attached to them. Most of them have nothing around them, like other than maybe a farm in great distance. But they've been beautifully preserved, and the shapes are rather different from the shapes of our bridges.
So really, the question or statement is, other covered bridges outside of Pennsylvania, they're definitely worth going to. The design features, they use something called like a slope portal. It's kind of their shtick. Ohio is a great area. If you go up by Erie into Ostabula, that area, and it's also a Mennonite area. So it's kind of interesting. And they have a 15 bridges. And I would recommend it because it's not, every bridge is a story, and it's just not the bridge, it's the location of the bridge, which is always interesting. Is there a creek? Columbia County is a great trip from here, Columbia, Northumberland, and they have a lot of bridges. A lot of them, you start from Knoebels and go from Knoebels the back way, and they're all different styles. They paint all the insides of theirs red for some reason, which doesn't make any sense to me, but that's their shtick basically. And they're all different designs, but it's always the location of the bridge, which is interesting. I know there's one outside of Lewisburg you can't get to because it's actually inside a prison area. It's inside, and you have to get special permission if you want to go photograph it. But it's between the penitentiary and the fence basically. But it's to me it's a great hobby, and it's been a hobby ever since the 1930s when people had cars and cameras. And when I did my research at Mercer Museum, I found 4 complete sets of tours in the 1930s people photographed, and maybe 20% of those bridges exist anymore. But it's called, covered bridge safari stuff when you get into a group and do it. It's an interesting hobby. Pennsylvania, we have so many bridges. You could stay busy for years doing that. Indiana's a great state. Ohio, I've seen them in Vermont's interesting for sure. Vermont has more per square mile than any state in the country. New Hampshire has a great set of bridges. There are actually covered bridges in New Brunswick, Canada, if you really go up that far. And they're pretty spectacular, bigger than ours. Yes. I don't know. I'd have to look at my covered bridge guide. But Indiana is a big state. California has covered bridges. So you could find a covered bridge in a lot of places. Yes, in the back. The CCC worked on repairing some bridges. What really happened with the covered bridges were in the late 1890s, early 1900s, there was something called the Good Roads Movement, which was originally for bicycles and then for motor vehicles. And they lobbied for more road construction. And during World War I, there was a crisis because the railroads were not working well. And Wilson actually nationalized the railroad system because they were getting war material to the docks and it was just rotting. They couldn't get it to Europe. And they decided at that point to invest the public money into roadways and not the railroads. And the state got a lot of money to refurbish any road that led to a county seat. So in Bucks County, between 1920 and 1940, I think we lost 29 bridges as part of that process. And there's very, very little they could do because they were basically all owned by the county at that point. The state repossessed them. And then the state decided bridge by bridge which one it was going to take down. The ones we have in Bucks County were in more remote areas, so they were not prioritized on the list. And that practice stopped after World War II. Okay, hearing no other questions, thanks for having me out. I'd be happy to chat with you after the presentation about bridges, and thanks for coming out. Thank you.
I have no idea. The one down there. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.